2022 is arriving soon and we need to do a check. What is the best privacy and freedom-oriented phone as of right now? Hands down, the answer is to use a de-Googled phone. But most people do not know what a de-Googled phone is, and if this is something you can realistically switch to. So I will explain what it is, and I will update this with newer information as of late 2021. I personally use a de-Googled phone. My daily driver is a Google Pixel 4. And that's one of the first things you're going to wonder about. My de-Googled phone is a Google Pixel? Sounds like an oxymoron. Stay tuned to understand. When you need better search results like those from Google but don't want the Google tracking, check out privacy search engine Startpage.com. It does not collect or share any of your personal data, so you can search anonymously. My company offers a VPN service, Bytes VPN, de-Googled phones, VPN routers, and now we offer a Braxmail email service. These products are made to protect you from big tech and their tricks to profile us. If you're interested in them, they are on my app BraxMe. The link is in the description. What's wrong with regular Google Androids and iPhones? As time has gone by, regular phones have become ultra-intrusive spy machines that track every event in your life. Both Apple and Google phones track your locations 24/7. They are capable of doing something called geofencing, which allows big tech companies to find out who among you are at specific places in the world and at specific times. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that this information alone is enough to profile you with your interests, your politics, and your behavior. The saddest part about this is that you're given the idea that there's some choice, that this is something you can turn off. Unfortunately, you cannot. Big tech has this absolute power, and you don't. Big tech added another feature recently, and that was mesh networking, or the ability of phones to discover other phones nearby. This was originally implemented to do contact tracing, to see who was near whom at the beginning of the pandemic. Now this has evolved. Apple has used this to track AirTags, which is a side effect, and that side effect is to know the location of the phone even without an internet connection. So when your phone tells you you are 5 minutes from your destination, without giving it a destination, take heed. That is but a minute piece of data it has on you. Standard phones have what is called a device fingerprint. No, I'm not talking about the fingerprints you use for logging in. I mean a forensic fingerprint or ID that enables your phone to be uniquely identified when it is on the internet. This piece of data, typically using the IMEI or International Mobile Equipment Identity Number, is sent to Google and Apple, so every interaction you have is tracked with a precise, unique identity. So your phone is considered your passport, and even when you log into a Google or Apple platform, they have an extra identifier on you, so you cannot hide and you cannot be anonymous. Both Google and Apple have extensive telemetry on each device. Each phone reports to HQ every few seconds or more often. Every app you use is noted. The time of use of each is determined. On top of all this, Google specifically knows your search activities and what websites you visit and are tracking all of this to understand you. It knows your politics, your sexual preferences, and your behavior in more ways than you think. And then it can use this knowledge of you to control what you see in platforms via censorship. Google and Apple command the two major app stores on mobile devices. If they deem content not to be suitable, then they can wipe it out. But this is not some democratic decision. It is something that they can enforce because it is part of their power. Recently, even Apple has added a feature to actually be able to tell what photos you have on your phone. Supposedly, it's to spot illegal images, but it is within their power to actually find out what is on your phone at all times. Now there's more. But I've just given you a small hint of what your phones have become. Given a choice, a computer is multiple times safer than any phone. Computers cannot track you in the ways a phone can because it doesn't have the same sensors. But there is a way to have a phone that's reasonably safe. At least it is safe by default, though you can make it unsafe by your own choices and behavior. The safest option of all is a de-Googled phone. If you understand how a de-Googled phone is constructed, then you will understand why it is different and why it has some major advantages versus the regular big tech operating systems. A de-Googled phone is an Android phone. And those who don't understand what this means will start to say that I'm talking nonsense. The Android OS on a phone is a very unique situation. Although Android is owned by Google and bought from the original people who started this mobile OS, there was a separate entity formed by Google, which is the Android Open Source Project, or AOSP. AOSP is actually made up of many companies, including most of the major manufacturers of phone hardware. AOSP is the starting basis of all the code that is in a Google Android phone. AOSP is the only basis of a de-Googled phone. AOSP is based on an open source license. Anyone can contribute changes to the project, and anyone can take the project and distribute it without restriction. In fact, the kernel of AOSP is pulled from Linux, which is also open source and required to be open source. Now, this may not match with your understanding of how Google Android works. How is it possible for Google Android to be open source and yet have all these secret apps running from Google itself? The reason is that Android Open Source Project does not have any Google specific code on it. The Google code is not open source. They are proprietary and are added to the project later by the OEM or the original equipment manufacturer. The Google code is separately licensed by the makers of the phone like LG, Samsung, Sony, and so on. This also explains how a company like Huawei is able to sell Android phones. It just takes the open source and distributes it. Huawei has no license to distribute the Google code. The Google code is called Google Apps or GApps, and this is installed over the Android Open Source Project files. Although Google adds additional apps to AOSP, the main thing GApps does is actually to replace many Android open source apps with proprietary ones. This is why you cannot remove Google Apps from a standard Google Android. The original open source versions are no longer there. The only way to de-Google is to start from scratch by installing AOSP fresh on the phone. Many organizations have come up with various versions of AOSP. The most popular one and the one with the longest history is the project currently known as Lineage OS. It was originally the Cyanogen Mod project, and then it was forked from there when that company shut down the project. Lineage OS is still completely open source, and what makes it unique is that it supports hundreds of phone models. There are other Android projects, some that focus more on security features like Graphene OS and Calyx OS. These are typically limited to Google Pixel hardware. But all of these projects are basically forks of Android Open Source Project. You can also install AOSP directly on phones without using any of these forks, or otherwise known as custom ROMs. However, typically the custom ROMs are more refined and configured better for particular devices than the plain vanilla AOSP. So when you install a Lineage OS 18.1 custom ROM on the phone, your phone is basically just Android 11. The phone will have the basic user interface of Android 11 and without the customization that was done by the manufacturers of the phones, the OEM, and without the Google apps. Many people add a custom ROM like a Lineage OS and then install it with GApps. So in essence, it has no real operational difference with a standard Googled Android. But then it wouldn't be de-Googled. A true de-Googled phone will never receive the GApps final installation. So what's missing on a de-Googled phone? What you will not find on a de-Googled phone is a Google login. Since it is not attached to Google in any way, you never log into Google. That alone is a very important point because the phone has no identity. And identity is the way a phone is tracked to you personally. The moment you log in with a Google ID or an Apple ID, your phone is being tracked with your personal identifier. But none of this exists on a Google phone. An external platform, even a YouTube, would see the model of the device, but it would not know the device fingerprint to match it to you personally. If you go to the browser of a Google phone and connect to Gmail or YouTube, you'd have to log into Google on that browser. During that moment, Google will know your identity. But once you log out and clear cookies, there will no longer be any attached identity to the phone. And even then, using the browser would not reveal the device IMEI or the fingerprint. The ability to hide the IMEI and other identifiers from non-system apps was added in Android 10. So since then, apps cannot retrieve the IMEI unless they had system permission. The system permission would exist, for example, on the carrier phone app that communicates with the cell radio, which is typically called the cell baseband modem. So outside of the carrier, there should be no other app in Android open source that is authorized to look at the device identifiers and send that information to a centralized database at Apple or Google. You can start to see now that there are immediate benefits to the Google phone. The main immediate effect is called pseudo-anonymity, which is the main foundation of privacy. One of the things implemented in Google Android phones was contact tracing. This is one of those failed app ideas since I don't think any of you care about installing contact tracing apps on your phone or Android. Maybe most people had enough sense about privacy. However, the internal code for this contact tracing is Bluetooth BLE, and this is enabled as part of the Google Apps code, whether or not you installed a contact tracing app. This is really bad since for contact tracing purposes, both Google and Apple phones started enabling this ability to track other phones nearby, and it would start by having phones emit a beacon that would be the identifier, which can be heard by nearby phones. I'm happy to say that this code does not exist, as far as I'm aware, on Android open source. So I believe the Google phones are not emitting this on-the-air identifier using Bluetooth that can capture your identity. When Google apps are running on a phone, Google monitors the activity on the phone. Each app is installed with telemetry code, and that monitoring is connecting to a Google feature called Firebase. This particular behavior does not exist on a Google phone. Most of this telemetry is needed to provide notifications. So if no special provision was made, the Google phones would have no notifications. But there's a way around that, and the Google phones are installed with a spoofer for notifications and Google services, so apps think they're still talking to Google Firebase. And notifications are passed through a third party for anonymization. This third-party app is called MicroG, or the MicroG project, and this is one of the necessary modules to a Google phone for it to work with popular apps. In order to install apps on the Google phones, typically the option that provides the best security is a store called F-Droid, and this is often pre-installed. This is an open source repository maintained by the fdroid.org project, and they curate apps and require that all apps be submitted with source code. So this is the first alternative store on a Google phone. For example, instead of Google Maps, you can find OpenStreetMaps or Osmand as your maps provider. There are a lot of apps on F-Droid, but they won't be the popular ones you know well. Whether we like it or not, the average consumer, and even I, want to install apps that are not on F-Droid. My own app Brax.me is on Google Play and not on F-Droid, and important apps like Signal are not on F-Droid either. The solution is a Google Play spoofer called Aurora Store. In the Google phones that we sell, we pre-install the Aurora Store. The Aurora Store has access to all the titles in Google Play and the latest versions. The trick, though, is that the Aurora Store uses a shared identity on the Google Store and then routes the download to the phone. In other words, you're anonymous on Google Play. So basically, most apps can be found and can install. There's another source of apps, and it's a website called apkpure.com. From here, you can not only download all Android apps, you can even download older versions, which may sometimes be needed for compatibility. Google apps will not run. There are exceptions to this, but I will discuss it later. So to make it clear, a de-Googled phone has no Google apps. This is sometimes hard for the average consumer to grasp. But if you want privacy, the first place to start is to control your use of apps. Use apps on your own terms and not have it foisted on you. Some people cannot handle this. Some of you are so dependent on Gmail, Google Docs, Google Drive, YouTube, Google Photos, Google Maps that you cannot function and think there are no alternatives. There are alternatives, but you have to change mindset if you're going to be ready for this. Alternatives imply some inconvenience. The truth of the matter is, I use a de-Google phone daily. I have no Google apps on the phone, not even YouTube. So no Gmail, no Google Maps, no Google Drive or Google Docs, Google Photos, YouTube. I would tell you anyway that using these products will have a big negative effect on your privacy, so you need to learn to stay away from them. But the reality is that for the most part, the phone is completely functional for even a tech guy like me. I don't find too many limitations, given some lines in the sand that every privacy-conscious person should draw anyway. Just know that aside from Google Apps, 90% of apps you are familiar with will work fine. I'm going to go back to the app's availability a bit later, but specific to Google, let me add that a de-Google phone will not be acceptable to Google for two-factor authentication. Google requires a Google authentication app to run on the phone, and that won't be possible on a de-Google phone. For some of you, 2FA using texting will be sufficient for Google purposes, but for some of us, specifically YouTube creators, we cannot use a de-Google phone for 2FA, and likely this will be the case for all in the future. So I have to have a reserved phone that's Googled just for 2FA purposes, like an old phone. But first, let's talk about the user interface of a de-Google phone. If you're coming from an iPhone, then yes, a de-Google phone will be different since it's an Android. If you're coming from another Android, then there is very little difference with a de-Googled app. Some phone manufacturers like Samsung tend to make more major user interface changes to the phone so they don't look like other Androids. In general, the prevailing user interface of a de-Googled phone running Lineage OS 18.1 will be the same as Android 11, and Lineage OS 17.1 will be the same as Android 10. In other words, it will be comfortable to someone who has learned to use Android. It is not as different as using, let's say, a Linux phone. It will feel like a normal phone. Now let's talk about the apps. In the end, this is the major showstopper with most people. If they can't get their favorite apps to run, then they will flatly say no to a de-Googled phone. First, I will start out with saying that certain apps really should not be used on a de-Googled phone, or you are defeating the purpose. Google apps, YouTube apps, Gmail apps, and Meta properties, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. These will wipe out the privacy on the phone. The Meta apps will run, but if you're going to use these, then you are not ready for a de-Googled phone. So don't bother. There are alternate ways of running these platforms, including the Google one, and that is to use the browser. In my company's case, we pre-installed DuckDuckGo as the browser. What I found is that most apps that do not work on a de-Googled phone will run fine when using the browser. So there's no dead end necessarily, just a little inconvenience. Now, something unique with Google Apps. 2 Google apps will work fine on a de-Google phone because they do not use Google services or Firebase. Waze will run, although it is owned by Google. Google Authenticator will run. I knew this would because it's open source. By the way, the only way to use Waze would be to not log in, and even then it's not the safest way to use street navigation. However, it is so frequently demanded that I offer it. There are some clear reasons why some apps will not work. If an app requires payment, they will not run. This is because you have no Google login, so you cannot link in a credit card on a de-Googled phone. For this reason, you will find that Uber, Lyft, Postmates, and such apps that require an in-app purchase will not work. But the browser can run Uber.com and Lyft.com just fine, so no dead end there. Apps that have to be purchased will not work, so any paid app will be in the exclusion list. Apps like Amazon, though they accept payments, work fine because the payment is not attached to Google Play. Some apps will pop a message saying they will not work without Google services. But most of these apps use a single Google service, which are notifications. And you will find that in spite of the warning message, they work fine. And this includes the evil apps like Facebook and Instagram. They pop a warning message, but they will work. However, some apps are totally dependent on Google Firebase. Since there's no direct connection to Google Firebase, they will fail. Apps that tend to fail in this category are those that need Google Maps extensively. Some banking apps will tend not to work. This may not be true of all banking apps, but just a quick test showed me that I couldn't run Bank of America, but I could run Wells Fargo and Chase. In the case of Bank of America, the app did not run because it wanted a signature from Google saying that the app was authentic. Since we have no actual Google Play, then we can't get that signature, and banking apps that require this will fail. But in my experience, this seems to affect only some of the banks. Now I will tell you the typical apps that are verified to run. No problem. And you can see that this is not some techie-only phone. I can run Kindle and Amazon apps. I can run Spotify, Netflix, Prime Video. I can run apps like Skype, Viber, Signal, Zoom, Jitsi, Session, Briar. I can run likely most social media apps like TikTok, Snapchat, Twitter, Discord, and so on. Now, I personally don't particularly use anything but Twitter. Although I cannot run a Gmail mail client, I can run some other email client like K9. I do not recommend running Gmail on the phone, even on a browser, but just forwarding Gmail messages to another email account. I recommend that you use a private email provider like my own Braxmail. I can run weather apps. I have run boating weather apps like Predict Wind and boating navigation apps like Navionics. These use GPS, and that means that GPS works just fine. You can run a Tesla app. You can run Waze, as I already mentioned earlier. You cannot use Android Auto since there's no Google service here. You can run both Google Authenticator and Authy for TOTP authentication. You can also run Duo. For YouTube, if you want to watch anonymously, you run NewPipe. You can watch and subscribe privately. The subscription is not known to YouTube, but allows you to follow content. We pre-install NewPipe. For security, you can run OpenVPN and Orbot. You can monitor your traffic with Glasswire and block traffic with NetGuard. Phone calls and texting are normal. Your contact lists are local only and don't get sent to Google. But an app could ask for this contact list, so it's up to you to never upload it to any platform or give it permission to see it. Generally, I use Signal as my messaging app. This means all my text messages show up on Signal. This is very nice because if my contact is on Signal, then the texting, phone calls, and video automatically go through Signal in an encrypted way. Otherwise, they use the carrier. So no special trick to be more secure. It's the same interface. Since you're not connected to Google Drive or iCloud, how about photos? How do you remove them from the phone? In my case, our phones are shipped to be in file transfer mode. So if you plug in the USB-C cable to your computer, you will be able to download the files and photos on it directly. If you get more sophisticated, you can use a product called Nextcloud to make your own private cloud instead of using Google or Apple. You can transfer contacts from another phone by converting contacts into a VCF format, which is available even on iCloud. Then you import it as a file onto the Google phone and it will automatically put it in the Contacts app. Overall, the experience is problem-free. The main group of people that will not benefit from a de-Googled phone are those tied to the news of big tech platforms in a big way, like those obsessed with Facebook and Instagram and the use of Google Docs, Google Photos, and Google Drive. I find that the heavy UI complaints will also tend to come from iPhone users not used to Android. That's to be expected, and frankly, no Android phone was ever sold with usage instructions, so obviously it can easily be figured out. I'm glad that currently I have an option. Because of the open source status of Android, we do not have to be forced to go the Google route. You can learn to de-Google some phone models yourself using instructions on lineageos.org. We also provide a de-Googling service for certain models, and we have phones that are already ready to go. Check them out on my store on the app Brax.me. I'm on the platform Odyssey.com. I'm now one of the top creators on there. Just for insurance in case I get deplatformed, please follow me there using the link in the description. Your engagement with this channel in the form of comments, likes, and especially subscriptions is very important to me. This channel grows because of you. So I hope you hit that subscribe button and that notification bell, and I truly appreciate it. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.